It's my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from the Behringer-Crawford Museum with tonight's presenter, Esther Drewry. Also joining me by the power of Zoom is BCM Visitor Services Associate and my co-host for the evening, Heather Cook, from her home in Cincinnati, Ohio. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's history museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralph B. Hale Jr. Foundation, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. We would love to hear from our viewers tonight. So if you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I will be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. So let's meet tonight's speaker. Esther Drewry is a graduate of Dixie Heights High School and a retired federal employee doing living history for the last 11 years. Drewry's primary focus is history and music of the colonial era. After joining her husband in the Drewry Family Historical Production Company, she became interested in the lives of women in the 18th century. This led to researching and doing presentations on these amazing women. She and her husband, Don, were married 11 years ago in a 1774 wedding at Fort Harrod. She is a proud mother of 2 and grandmother of 5. So thank you so much for joining us, Esther.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, there is a quiz question tonight. So the first respondent to enter a correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live will win a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize, and most importantly, bragging rights. So tonight's question is, who were the camp followers during the American Revolution? So please answer those, get your answers in on the chat or in the Q&A or on your Facebook Live. You can leave them in the comments, and Heather's going to be sure to keep track of that and see who gets the correct answer first and wins. Okay, so Esther, if you are ready, we are going to go ahead and get you on here. Move that, and we're going to share our screen. So just one moment, and we will get this pulled up. We are going to go to play, and we should be good. And there you go.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This evening, we're going to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. When I started doing living history with my husband, he included a little about the women. I became very interested and started doing research, and a new program was born. We will be looking at the women during the American Revolution and in early Kentucky. While the women in the 13 colonies were trying to raise their families and run their homes, they were also worried about the independence and the impending war with Britain. The ladies on the frontier were worried about starvation, wild animals, and Native American raids. Let's start with the ladies outside of Kentucky. Mammy Kate was a slave belonging to Stephen Harrod in Georgia. Stephen was captured and imprisoned at Fort Cornwallis for his part in the Battle of Kettle Creek. He would have been executed had it not been for the actions of Mammy Kate. When she heard of her master's imprisonment, she knew she had to come to his rescue. Kate gained the trust of the British by doing their laundry. Now, she had to ride to Augusta using one of her master's horses to get there where he was at. She told him she wanted to give Harrod clean clothes. At first, they refused. In the end, they allowed her to visit him. As the story goes, Mammy Kate took a large laundry basket with her and convinced Stephen to climb into the basket. She placed the basket on her head and walked out with him hid under a few linens. Now, the slide or the picture you see here, that is not Mammy Kate, but it's a depiction of how she would have been carrying that basket on her head with her master inside of the basket. This seems to be impossible when you look at this, but Mammy Kate was described as a tall, fearless woman and he was described as being diminutive. For saving his life, he gave her and her husband, Daddy Jack, a gardener, their freedom. They remained on the plantation, and he had a cabin built for them. They were both buried in the family cemetery. It is interesting to note that the freed Mammy Kate willed her 9 children to Stephen Harrod's children upon her death. Although this seems odd to us, you must keep in mind that a freed slave would have had to have left the plantation and left the state. They would have had to go to a freed state up north. By doing this, they were running the chance of being caught and returning to slavery. And at that, they may not have had a good master. So even though they would have been free, their life would have been very hard. Deborah Sampson was born in Clinton, Massachusetts in 1760 to a family descended from Pilgrim founders of Plymouth. Despite this illustrious lineage, her childhood was spent in poverty and hardship. Her father deserted the family, and at the age of 10, she had to hire out as an indentured servant to the family of Jeremiah Thomas in Middleburg. Jeremiah was an ardent American patriot, and his views greatly influenced Deborah. Upon gaining her independence at the age of 18, she worked as a weaver and briefly as a school teacher, earning recognition for her skills and strength. In May of 1782, Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man by wearing men's clothing and joining the army at Oxford, Massachusetts, under the name of Robert Sutcliffe. This was her second time of joining, but she was discovered the first time. The picture that you're looking here is of Deborah Sampson. This is actually a drawing of her, and that is her depicted as a soldier on the Continental Line. She joined the Light Infantry Company of the 4th Massachusetts Regiment under the command of Captain George Webb. This unit, consisting of 50 to 60 men, was first quartered in Bellingham, Massachusetts, and later mustered at Worcester, with the rest of the regiment commanded by Colonel William Shepard. The light infantry companies were elite troops. They were specially picked because they were taller and stronger than the average. Their job was to provide rapid flank coverage for advancing regiments, as well as rear guard and forward reconnaissance duties for units on the move. Because she had joined an elite unit, Sampson's disguise was more likely to succeed, since no one was likely to look for a woman among soldiers who were specially chosen for their above average size and superior physical ability. Sampson fought in several skirmishes, and in June of 1782, she and 2 sergeants led about 30 infantrymen on an exhibition that ended with a confrontation of Tories, often one-on-one. She also led a raid on a Tory home, which resulted in the capture of 15 men. The truth of Sampson's sex survived several close calls throughout her service prior to her actual discovery. During her first battle on July 3rd of 1782, outside of Tarrytown, New York, she was shot twice in her thigh by a musket and sustained a cut on her forehead from a sword. She begged her fellow soldiers not to take her to the doctor out of fear her sex would be discovered. But a soldier put her on his horse and took her to the hospital. A doctor treated her head wound, but she left the hospital before he could attend to her leg. Deborah removed one of the balls herself with a penknife and a sewing needle, but the other was too deep for her to reach. She carried it in her leg for the rest of her life, and it never fully healed. On April 1st of 1783, she was assigned to new duties. She spent 7 months serving as a waiter for General John Patterson. During the summer of 1783, Sampson become ill while she was in Philadelphia and was cared for by Dr. Barnabas Biney. After Sampson became unconscious due to a fever, Dr. Biney removed her clothes to treat her and discovered the cloth she used to bind her breast. Without revealing his discovery to Army authorities, he took her to his house where his wife, daughters, and a female nurse cared for her. In September of 1783, following the signing of the Treaty of Paris, November 3rd was set as the date for the soldiers to muster out. When Dr. Biney asked Sampson to deliver a note to General Patterson, she correctly assumed that it would reveal her sex. In other cases, women who pretended to be men to serve in the Army were reprimanded, but General Patterson gave her a discharge, a note with some words of advice, and enough money to travel home. She was honorably discharged at West Point, New York, by General Henry Knox on October 25th, 1783, after a year and a half of service. To help support her family, Deborah did speaking engagements telling about her time in the war. It is unknown how many women disguised themselves to fight in the war, because it is unknown of how many of them went undiscovered. There were groups of ladies that we don't know who they were. Their names are not listed, only their actions. An example would be camp followers. Camp followers during the American Revolution was anyone that followed the military encampment, but were not military, but provided goods or services. This would include the teamsters that drove the wagons, trackers, wives, and children of the soldiers. The women and children had to provide a service to remain in the camp. The children would help forage for food and firewood. Women would act as nurses, laundresses, and they would help any way they could. After a battle, the women and the children would go through the field and take anything they could from the dead soldiers: weapons, clothes, shoes, food, etc. One of the most famous camp followers is Molly Pitcher. And the picture you see here would have been sort of what a camp would have been like for these ladies and these children. The local militia would have helped from the ladies. They would have helped make balls for the guns, load the guns, and even fight when necessary. And the slide you see here is a depiction of what possibly Molly Pitcher would have looked like when she used the cannon after her husband was shot. She started firing the cannon. Now, let's move on to Kentucky. Kentucky comes from the Iroquois Native American word Kaintucky. It means meadowland. Kentucky was a county in Virginia and a frontier wilderness. It didn't become a state until June 1st, 1792. Unlike today, where husbands and wives discuss major decisions, the ladies had little or no input about going to Kentucky. A lot of stories from Kentucky involve Native American raids and capture. I feel it's important to note that although the actions of these Native Americans would have been considered savage, their families, lands, homes, and hunting grounds were all at risk. They were doing what we would do: protect their homes and families. If you were in their place, would you do any different? It's hard to tell who was the first white woman in Kentucky, but it was most likely Mary Draper Ingalls. Mary was born in Philadelphia in 1732 to Irish immigrants. Mary, along with her family, migrated down the meadow to current-day Blacksburg, Virginia. The American natives would pass by Draper's Meadow on their way to fight another tribe, which were further south. However, in July of 1755, while the men were tending to the fields, the Shawnee attacked the settlement, killing some and taking Mary and other members of her family, including her 2 young sons, captive. The statue that you're looking here is actually a statue that's in Radford, Virginia, and it is supposed to be Mary, although they had no drawings or anything of Mary. This is actually one of the descendants of Mary who posed for this. There's 2 of these statues, one in Radford, Virginia, where Mary ended up at, and the other one is in front of Boone County Public Library because her journey began in Boone County. So that's the 2 of the statues. The captives were taken hundreds of miles into the wilderness on their way to the Shawnee village in current-day Chillicothe, Ohio. Her son Thomas was taken to Detroit. Her younger son was adopted into another tribe where he soon passed away. Mary was given into servitude to a French trader. That fall, they all traveled to a salt lick in what is now Big Bone State Park to get salt for the tribe. After 2.5 months, Mary saw her opportunity to run away. With only a tomahawk and 1 blanket, Mary made her escape. During the escape, Mary walked through Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia. She used her memory and following the waterways to make her way back home. Because she had to go around deeper bodies of water, it is not certain how far she did walk, but the estimate is about 500 miles. After 40 days, Mary made her way home. Later, she and William moved to Radford, Virginia, where they established a homestead and a ferry operation. They lived there until her death on February 1st of 1815. At the age of 17, Thomas was returned to the family. This is an obelisk that's in a cemetery there in Radford, not where Mary is buried, but the stones used in that were the stones from the fireplace in Mary's cabin, which was destroyed previously. So that was kind of neat to see that. There were several women who found themselves living in the wilderness of Kentucky. One of the most recognized is Rebecca Boone. Rebecca Bryan was born in Virginia on January 9th, 1738. In 1749, Rebecca's family moved to the western Piedmont region of North Carolina. In 1750, 15-year-old Daniel Boone and his family settled near the Bryans. On August 14th, 1756, Daniel and Rebecca were married. During their married life, Daniel was exploring and left Rebecca home with their 10 kids. In 1755, Daniel was part of a group of about 30 axemen to clear a path to Kentucky. They reached the Kentucky River and built a fort, calling it Boonesboro. By late 1799, Rebecca and the children joined Daniel at Fort Boonesboro. It is believed that Rebecca Boone was the first white woman to live in Kentucky. In 1799, Daniel Boone and his family left Kentucky and moved to current-day Missouri. Daniel and Rebecca was married in Missouri, but the remains was later moved to Frankfort, Kentucky. You can see here the top 2 pictures are of the current fort, which is a rebuilt fort. It was rebuilt in the 1970s. The bottom is a kind of more what the original fort would have looked like. Now, Fort Boonesboro is not on the exact location of where the original fort was, but it is close. Capture at Boonesboro. July 14th, 1776, Elizabeth and Fanny Calloway and Jemima Boone, Daniel and Rebecca Boone's daughter, were captured by Shawnee while they were a short distance from Fort Boonesboro in a canoe on the Kentucky River. The girls ranged in age from 14 to 16. Elizabeth broke off twigs and tore small pieces of fabric from her dress, which she dropped to aid in their rescuers. The girls were rescued after 2 days when the captors were surprised by a rescue party early one morning. Days later, Elizabeth married Samuel Henderson on August 7th. On May 29th, 1777, Elizabeth gave birth to Fanny, who was the first non-Native American child to be born to a couple married in Kentucky. The girl's capture has been a subject of murals and paintings. James Fenimore Cooper used this tale in his classic, The Last of the Mohicans. Jane Coons come to Kentucky with her husband William and her children in 1775. They were members of a group of Catholics from Maryland. In 1776, Jane became the first school teacher in Kentucky, but is given credit for being the first woman at Fort Harrod to boil spring water and produce salt. In her teaching of the Fort children, Mrs. Coombs used a primitive version of the Old English horn book. These books was of clapboard and paddle shaped, with handles whittled down to fit little fingers. The alphabet or the Lord's Prayer was crudely drawn with berry juices or charcoal. Jane felt the fresh air was important for the kids. So at her request, the schoolhouse had no chinking between the walls. This is a picture of the recreated schoolhouse, which is at Fort Harrod. And as you notice the gaps in between the logs, in the winter, that had to have been awfully drafty. The Coombs family remained at the fort for 9 years, during which William Coombs took an honorable part in the defense of the station through the siege of 1776-1777. He cleared the land and helped with the provisioning of the fort. One of her sons was in the famous Battle of Blue Licks. The family relocated to Nelson County in 1784. Now this is the inside of the schoolhouse, and there's an interesting couple there playing music. That is my husband and I. We're at Fort Harrod several times a year, and often we are in the schoolhouse, so that's how I know it can be drafty in there. While we're at Fort Harrod, let's visit another lady there, Anne McGinty. Anne was a widow that married William Pogue in Augusta County, Virginia in 1744. After living in a few places in 1755, William Pogue and his family moved to Harrodsburg, Kentucky. Anne bought her spinning wheel on her horse with her. She found out that flax was not available in the early days of the fort. Anne discovered that wild nettle, which grew in abundance, would work as a substitute. She gathered and prepared it, spun it into yarn. She experimented with roots, barks, and nutshells. Anne ran an ordinary at the fort. The ordinary was a tavern gathering place. It was an inn for visitors. Anne lived to an old age and died in the ordinary that she runs at the fort. Now the pictures you see here, the one to the left, is the entryway into the ordinary. And again, this is at the rebuilt fort at Fort Harrod. On the right is a list showing kind of what some of the services was and what they would have charged for those services at the time that Anne had the house or the ordinary. And when they're talking about the lodging, you don't get your individual room and you didn't get your own bed. In fact, if you did get a bed, you shared it with somebody else. More often you put your bedroll down on the floor and you slept in the floor. There was 2 rooms upstairs. One side was where the men slept. The other side was where the ladies slept. Kept them separate. She was buried in the cemetery at Fort Harrod, and here is a photo of her grave. Her grave can still be visited there today if you go to the fort and you go to where the old cemetery is, and there's lots of stones there, but one of them is Anne McGinty. The women of Bryan Station. Now, In researching this, I have seen it as Bryan, Bryans. I have also seen it as Bryant's. As you notice here, this says Bryant's. I'm going to go with the one that I saw more often, which was Bryan, but it could also be Bryant's. The British had allied with the Native American tribes in the area of Bryan Station. They were still trying to drive settlers from the land. The fort at Bryan Station, near Lexington, Kentucky, would bear the brunt of one of these attacks. The station was guarded by only 44 men, which was no match for the approximately 350 British Rangers and warriors that would descend upon the fort. On August 15, 1782, the British and the Native Americans arrived that evening. They hoped that they could lure the defenders of the fort out and surprise them. However, the colonists knew that the enemy was nearby and wouldn't leave the fort. In the fort, they had no water, which would be necessary to survive the attack. They come up with a plan. As they did every morning, the women left the protection of the fort and walked to the spring to fill buckets with water. The enemies had no choice but to let the women continue to the spring, because otherwise it would give up their element of surprise. The women knew the risk that they were taking. They would be out of range of the garrison's guns and be point blank in range with hundreds of enemy's weapons. While pretending they didn't know about the enemy hiding nearby, the women calmly left the protection of the fort and made their way to the stream. They collected the water and returned to the safety of the fort. The closer they got to the fort, they walked quicker and quicker. These brave women collected enough water to withstand the attack. After a few days, the British and the Native American force become frustrated and left. A relief party was arriving about the same time the British was leaving. The relief party pursued the British, and the Battle of Blue Licks would follow on August 19th. The Battle of Blue Licks was one of the last battles of the Revolutionary War. It occurred 10 months after Lord Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, which effectively ended the war. The battle lasted 15 minutes, and 70 colonists were killed. Daniel and Rebecca Boone's son, Israel, and Daniel's nephew, Thomas Boone, was among those that were killed. This is a memorial at Bryan Station to those brave ladies. On June 24th, 1780, British and Canadian militia, 150 of them, along with Native Americans, 600 to 900 strong, raided Ruddle Station near Cynthiana, Kentucky. On June 26th, they raided Martin Station near Paris. A smaller group also destroyed Grant Station, which was about 5 miles northeast of Bryan Station. Of the almost 500 settlers from both Ruddles and Martin Station, a few was killed outright, and some died along the way to Detroit and Canada. Several were taken by the Indians, mostly from Ruddle Station, to be adopted into their tribe and were held for up to 15 years. It was estimated that 1/10 of all Kentucky population was taken at those two forts. There was about 60 women and girls captive from Ruddle Station and about 35 from Martin Station. There were at least 2 girls born while their mothers was captive. This number includes my 7-time grandmother and 3 of her daughters while they were at Martin Station. Several slaves was captured at Ruddles and Martin Stations, but only a few of their names have been preserved. The number of slaves that were at these stations were unknown. Most of the slaves that were captured were either resold or taken in possession of the Indians or the British soldiers. Jane Todd Crawford is famous as the first woman to survive surgery to remove an ovarian cyst. Believed to be pregnant with twins at the age of 45, and if that wouldn't kill you, I don't know what would. Crawford and her local doctors discovered that something was amiss. As her due date came and went without any sign of birth, Dr. Ethan McDowell, who had already earned the regional acclaim as a physician and a surgeon, came to consult on the case. He diagnosed Crawford with an ovarian tumor and virtual death sentence in the early 19th century. He warned her that no similar tumor have ever been successfully removed. An attempt to do so would likely result in her death. Yet Crawford elected to have the procedure done. The doctor would only perform the operation in his office, which was in Danville. Crawford rode the 60 miles from her Greene County home to Danville and arose on Christmas Day, 1809. Operating without anesthesia, not yet in use, McDowell worked for nearly a half an hour to remove the growth, while Crawford reportedly sung hymns. The surgery resulted in a 22.5-pound cyst to be removed. She remained with him for almost a month and then went home on January 1810. She lived another 32 years after the procedure. Okay.
Are we good?
We're good.
Okay.
We're
just at 7 o'clock.
Oh.
So
okay.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I looked at the wrong.
No, yeah, I was just telling you.
Okay.
Let's
continue.
I was gonna say you can keep going. You still
All
got
right.
time.
This is a picture. Sorry, everybody. This is a picture of Jane Todd Crawford, the lady who had the cyst removed. Nancy Hart, nee Ann Morgan, was born about 1735 in either Pennsylvania or North Carolina. She died in 1830 in Kentucky. There's lots of stories about her in the American Revolution. She was quite the lady. Ann Morgan grew up in a colony in North Carolina. She is traditionally said to have been related to both Daniel Boone and General Daniel Morgan. However, there's no evidence of this. She and her husband, Benjamin Hart, moved to Wilkes County, Georgia. She was well able to handle a rifle in the fierce and bloody fighting that beset Georgia during the American Revolution. Nancy Hart was a Stuart supporter of the Whig cause. A few stories of her exploits in the war circulated for years before being written down. The best known story told of the day when 5 or 6 armed Tories arrived at her cabin and demanded that she cook them a meal. As she roasted her last turkey, shot by one of the Tories, her young daughter slipped away to arouse neighboring men. Hart plied the Tories with whiskey and contrived to get near their stack of white rifles. She put 2 rifles through a crack in the logs before she was detected, and she quickly took up a third to defend herself. One of the men rushed her and was shot dead. She wounded another. When help arrived, they were going to shoot the Tories, but Nancy told them not to waste their powder, to hang them. The Tories was taken into the woods and were hung. In 1912, a railroad company's archaeological exhibition of the land near the Hart's cabin unearthed 6 skeletons that had been hung, suggesting that some version of this myth was true. Other stories told of Hart's acting as a spy for Georgia Patriot forces, crossing the Savannah River on a raft with logs tied with grapevines to bring back information from the enemy camps. After the war, the Harts moved to Brunswick, Georgia, where Benjamin Hart died. Nancy Hart later moved to Kentucky. Her story was told by Elizabeth F. Elliott and Women of the American Revolution. In 1853, Hart County, Georgia, and in 1856, its seat, Hartwell, was named in her honor. Jenny Wiley was a pioneer woman who lived in the 18th century and what is now Eastern Kentucky. Her story is one of courage, perseverance, and survival in the face of incredible adversity. Born in Virginia in 1760, Jenny married Thomas Wiley when she was just 16 years old. The couple moved to current Floyd County, Kentucky in 1780. where they built a cabin and began farming. And began farming. In 1789, Jenny was captured by a group of Native American Indians who was hiding in the area. She was taken captive along with her 6 children, 2 of whom were killed during the raid. Jenny and her surviving children were taken on a grueling journey through the wilderness to a Shawnee village in what is now Ohio. There, they were separated from each other and forced to adopt a new way of life. For the next 11 years, Jenny lived as a captive of the Shawnee tribe. She was given the name Old Woman, and she was forced to do hard labor and endure harsh living conditions. Despite these challenges, Jenny never lost hope that one day she would be reunited with her family. In 1800, Jenny finally escaped from captivity with the help of a friendly Native American woman. She made her way back to Kentucky, where she was reunited with her husband and some of her children. Jenny's story quickly became legendary in Kentucky and beyond. She became known as a symbol of strength and resilience in the face of adversity. In 1810, she published a memoir of her experiences titled Jenny Wiley, An Unfortunate Woman. Jenny Wiley State Park is named after her. Anne Henry Christian, a pioneer who was born in Hanover County, probably the late 1730s or early 1740s, was the daughter of Sarah Winston Sim Henry and her second husband, John Henry, a Scottish immigrant. Her siblings included one Patrick Henry, an orator and governor of Virginia, and Elizabeth Henry Campbell Russell, a Methodist lay leader in Washington County. In early 1768, she married William Christian, and during the first year of their marriage, they lived in Roanoke River Valley. After a few other moves in the spring of 1785, Annie, William, and their children, and an undetermined number of slaves, moved to Kentucky. Annie's letter to her sister-in-law, which told of the trek along the Wilderness Road and her early months in Kentucky, contained the best first-person accounts of that portion of the Western movement that survived from the pen of any woman. Her letters, which her sister-in-law preserved, strongly influenced later generations' understanding of the effects on women of the westward movement and life on the frontier. By August 1785, they had settled on Bear Grass Creek, which is near present-day Louisville, Kentucky. William was killed on April 9th, 1786, while participating in an exhibition against the Indians north of the Ohio River. After a few moves, Annie and her family settled in Cove Spring near Danville. Deciding that she would prefer to rent a plantation because it would be less expensive than having to stock and supply her own, she moved again in September of 1787. Annie managed the family financial affairs with 2 goals in mind: protecting her children's inheritance and returning to Virginia. In September of 1788, Annie and 5 of her children, together with a few slaves, returned to Virginia. Her daughters eventually moved back to Kentucky, but it is not certain whether she intended to go back herself. In the spring of 1789, she became ill, probably tuberculosis. She wrote a will in October of that year, providing for her children, and then sailed to the West Indies in order to recover her health. She apparently spent the winter on the island of Antigua, and returned to Virginia in the spring. Annie Henry Christian died in North Fork on May 4th, 1790, shortly after she landed. Mary Ellen Britton, from 1855 to 1925, was an American physician, educator, suffragette, journalist, civil rights activist from Lexington. Britton was the original member of the Kentucky Negro Education Association, which formed in 1877. She was president of the Lexington Women's Improvement Club and later served as a charter member of the Ladies Orphan Society, which funded the Colored Orphans Industrial Home in Lexington in 1892. During her lifetime, she accomplished many things through the obstacles she faced. After teaching Black children in Lexington public schools, she worked as a doctor from her home in Lexington. She specialized in hydrotherapy, electrotherapy, and massage. She was officially granted her license to practice medicine in Lexington in 1902, making her the first woman doctor to be licensed in Kentucky, in Lexington. Unlike our founding fathers, most of the ladies weren't included in our history. There is little documentation on the action of these amazing ladies. The women themselves didn't feel that they were doing anything extraordinary. Some of the letters of the men were kept, but not the ladies. When researching for the ladies, sometimes the best sources are to go through their husbands or fathers. Sometimes there are letters to the ladies or to their wives or their daughters were mentioned in their letters. No matter if they were in towns or frontiers, these amazing women were brave and did what they needed to do to protect their homes and their families. They stood up to the British to help gain our freedom from Britain and the dangers of the frontier to keep their families safe. And doing this, they helped to expand the country westward.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much, Esther. That was a great presentation. Let me go ahead.
Sorry about that confusion.
No, it's okay. Let's see. Stop sharing our screen. And we are going to connect with Heather. And Heather's been keeping track of all of our trivia answers to the question. Do we want to go ahead and repeat that question and see if we have a winner?
Yeah, the question was, who were the camp followers during the American Revolution? And we had many answers, all of which contained some part of the answer. So I wanted to see what Esther thought about some of the closest ones, see which one she thought was best.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and read what the answer is so people know what the entire encompassment is. It was the camp followers were anyone, man, woman, or child that were not part of the military that followed the encampment and provided goods or services. This included the teamsters that drove the wagons, the scouts, and the wives and the children of the soldiers. So everyone knows that's what the full answer is.
Mm-hmm.
So many people just said like women and wives, but we did have two answers that were much closer. The first one that was turned in was that camp followers were the women who provided domestic services for the soldiers during the American Revolution, such as laundry and seamstresses. And that one included the work goods aspect as the first one that was turned in. And then over the entire period of the history hour, we had somebody else answer women who were wives and mothers of the soldiers, wives, mothers, children, and the soldiers, and forgotten revolutionaries. Men were also included. All were non-military.
Second one would probably be the closest.
The second one,
Mm-hmm.
I will go ahead and message that person. That is actually Pamela Manker. So congratulations, Pamela, for getting that answer, adding to it throughout the whole presentation. If you can send us your mailing address so we can get you your prize, that would be great.
Yes, and Pamela, you can do that by privately messaging us, and then we'll get your prize sent out to you. So congratulations. So Heather, have we had some questions or comments?
We have had one question so far, and it was someone noticed that on one of the tombstones it said Mrs. William Coons, and they were wondering if it was common for the first name of women to be left off of their tombstone.
from this over
Okay,
here.
that actually was not a tombstone. That is a plaque that's in front of the school at Fort Harrod, just to recognize her. But yes, that was very common. Women of that period really had no personal identity. Their identity was from their husbands or their fathers. In fact, it was not uncommon. In fact, as an example, when Benjamin Franklin wrote to his wife, Deborah, he referred to her as my dear child. So these women were not like we are today. So that would have been normal, that they would have been recognized more as Mrs. William Coons than Jane Coons.
And it's pretty interesting, and we've come such a long way since then. So far we don't have any other questions, so if people want to get those in. Oh,
Yeah.
never mind. We do have some stuff in the Q&A that I
Oops. Yes, if anyone has any question or comment, please put it in the chat or in the Q&As and we can get those answered.
That is the only question that we have right now.
Okay.
Oh, you didn't get
No,
another
it
one.
was contact info.
Oh, okay. Perfect. For Pamela?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and get them in now. I'll look at
Somebody
here.
else just asked if you could elaborate on
I see
Mary
that.
Ellen Britton and how she managed through the Civil War being an African American.
You know, I'm not sure. To be perfectly honest, it would not have been easy because Kentucky was a neutral state and it eventually did become a northern state. So that would have probably been part of it. It would not have been easy for her anyway. But that would be, my research really never did bring that up. But that would be my best guess, is because originally Kentucky was a neutral state, but then eventually we went as a northern state. So that would have been my best guess. Nothing like somebody asks you a question you don't really know the answer to.
Well, I have a question. Can I raise my hand? So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you do as a living historian, because I find that very interesting. So I was thinking maybe you could elaborate on that.
As a living historian, part of what I do is what I've done here tonight. Also, normally, the first time Mary Jane saw me, I was in colonial clothing. So I go in, I do presentations. We go to reenactments. A big example would be at Boone's, or at, we've done Boonesboro, we've done Fort Harrod several times a year. But we go to Big Bone for the Salt Festival. And we will be there playing music. So a lot of times we're playing music of the period on instruments of the period. And we try to throw in a little history. But our goal is to try to get this information out to people, especially with the women, because when I was in school, honestly, I hated history. Coming from a living historian, right? I got bored with this battle took place here and this date and these many people got killed. And that's important. You need that information as pegs to put stuff on. But for me, it's the people and what the people did. So as a living historian, we do these presentations, we go to reenactments, we try to get the information out, as opposed to just a reenactor. And I shouldn't say it that way, not just a reenactor, but there's reenactors and then there's living historians. The reenactors go and they are there, they definitely add to an event, but not quite as much as living historians, where we get into doing presentations and bringing in more of the history. And I'm not putting down any of my reenactor friends, because I have a bunch of them and they're awesome people. So don't think that I'm putting them down. By any means, I'm not, but there is a difference.
Okay. We have another, let's see. We have someone asked, Esther, could you recommend any books on the women of Kentucky through the Revolutionary and Civil War time periods?
I think there is one available that's talking about the women at Fort Boonesboro. So your best bet would to be go through sites like that. Primarily, most of my research and the thing when I do presentations, it's more on the women of the American Revolution, as opposed to the women of Kentucky. This is really my first real big dive into the women of Kentucky. But you know, if you go through like the forts, there are some books, and then you could go through their websites, Fort Boonesboro and Fort Harrod both. They probably have books there. If you want to get into more of the other ladies, not necessarily Kentucky, the one that I really highly recommend is Founding Mothers, and it's by Cokie Roberts, the news reporter. That's an excellent book, and she talks about a number of the ladies and what they did during the American Revolution to get our freedom. But as far as for Kentucky and that, like I said, I know there's one that's the Women of Boonesboro, I believe, or something like that is the title of it. Unfortunately, a lot of this history is not really written down, or you find it hodgepodge here and there. I mean, I've spent a lot of time Googling and searching. You know, of course, I'm familiar with some of the ladies that was at Boonesboro, some of the ladies that was at Harrod, because we have done events there. And so I am familiar with those ladies. Ruddles and Martin Station, I am familiar with that because, like I said, my grandmother and her children was at Martin Station. So there's a group of people that do that. They do research and stuff on the Ruddles and Martins. So I'm kind of familiar with that. So really, your best bet would be to try to go through like the forts and see what they would have.
All right, thank you. Hopefully that helps you, Maureen, helps you find
Google.
Yeah.
Google's our friend.
Yes. We were just talking about how much we love Googling. But I wanted to mention also that we've got a lot of comments and a lot of feedback saying, thanking you, and that you're so interesting, and that they've found this presentation, you know, to be very
good. I'm
very
glad.
wonderful.
And I didn't go into a lot of depth on these ladies, because if you really get into them, there's a lot more to some of these ladies than what I went through. But because of time constraint, and I wanted to touch a little bit on several different ladies, you know, I didn't go into huge big depth. But if, like I said, Google is your friend, you know, and you can really, they're fascinating ladies. And my goal tonight was to kind of get some of this information to hopefully get you kind of curious and maybe do some research on your own to see what these ladies were all about.
That's awesome. And so if anyone was interested in trying to find out more about what you do, or maybe see one of your living history, how would they be able to do that?
We have a website and we have a Facebook page. Just, you can look it up under Drewry Family Historical Production Company. I've forgotten myself. Drewry Family Historical Production Company, and we have a website and a Facebook page.
All right, thank you.
Or I have a Facebook page. Esther Drewry.
Heather, do we have anything else, or are we good?
They just have another question come in. They said that they had read that the Ingalls woman was pregnant and her child was brought up as an Indigenous American. She left him behind and was wondering if you knew anything about that.
I am, and I did not really bring that up because there was a book wrote by one of Mary Ingalls' sons, not one of them that was captured, but one of them that she had later. And he did not mention that in the book. So there is some contention on whether that really happened or not. So therefore, I wasn't sure about it one way or another. Therefore, I didn't bring it up. I'm a friend with a member that a lady that is a direct line descendant of Mary Ingalls. In fact, she's the lady that the statue was designed after. And she planned a wonderful, wonderful trip. I'm a member of the Mary Ingalls DAR. And we went to Radford, and they have Ingalls Day. And they have a weekend where they have a big event where you can learn more about Mary Ingalls. And that's, so I know her. I know she's done some presentations for the chapter. And the child is, maybe, maybe not. We're not 100% sure exactly whether it was something she just didn't bring up because it was too painful, or whether it didn't really happen. We're not sure. Great question.
Very interesting. All right. We're getting a lot more feedback. Great presentation. Thanks for sharing. Women, we should be journaling about our lives. Oh, that's a good point.
That
Maureen.
is a very good point.
Very interesting. Okay, so I see we're about out of time. If anybody, I don't see any other questions. We're gonna go ahead and wrap up. Heather, you ready? We do have some promotions going on here at the museum, so we gotta let everyone know about those. So we have our new exhibit on display. That is called Dancing with Nature. It's a wildlife photography exhibit of the natural world in Northern Kentucky through the lens of Kira McNeil. Now, the exhibit features herons, starlings, deer, spiders, all kinds of different animals, all framed with salvaged, repurposed wood from old structures on Kira's farm. So it's very cool. I encourage everyone to come check it out. It is on exhibit it's on display rather through August 13th. So come in and check that out. Also on display still is our Art of Fashion, Faye Applegarth Maddox. Very cool exhibit on the one-of-a-kind illustrations and the advertising that Faye did for local newspapers from 1945 to 1965. Her elaborate drawings were used for Reeds of Hyde Park, McAlbin, Shillitoes, among others. So come and check those out. That's on display through August 20th. Music at BCM is back again next Thursday, so that's tomorrow. So our next concert's tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Doors open at 6 with I believe it's Iconics or Iconics. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, so hopefully I will learn that tomorrow. But they're playing quality renditions of the classic hits from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. They feature different flavors of rock, pop, disco, and soul. So please bring chairs or blankets for seating, as there is limited seating. In case of rain, which hopefully the rain will hold off, but in case of rain, we will move indoors. So rain or shine, or we will still have the concert. The following concert is going to be on July 6th. We've got Jake Speed and the Freddies. So you can see the complete Music at BCM schedule on our website at bcmuseum.org. Just so everyone knows, it is our last call for artists. This Friday is the last day for artists to apply for fresh art and silent art. So if you know someone that might be interested in creating art or submitting completed art to be auctioned off to support the museum, please help spread the word. Fresh Art 2023 is going to be on September 9th. You can learn more about that at bcmuseum.org. Lastly, our next Northern Kentucky History Hour will be on Wednesday, July 12th. This will be our 100th episode. That's going to be with St. Vincent de Paul of Northern Kentucky, where they're celebrating 100 years of service in Northern Kentucky. So that's going to be with Karen Zengel. We are looking forward to that. So please tune in. Also, for more Northern Kentucky history throughout the week, check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel at BC Museum, where you can find the latest curators chat, along with all of our past Northern Kentucky History Hour presentations. So please like and subscribe. That's all that we have time for this evening. Thank you again to all of our sponsors and the supporters of BCM. And thank you so much, Esther, for your wonderful presentation. Until next time, everyone take care and good night. Have a great night.